Well, good afternoon, everybody. An intractable war which has gone on forever, an inextricable knot of seemingly irreconcilable religious and political conflicts, massacres and interventions, starvation, great power interventions which fuel the conflict. Sound familiar? No, not Syria and the Middle East today, but Germany in the 30 Years' War. All this was solved, as we've just heard, at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which enshrined really four things. First of all, power sharing based on juridification of conflict. Secondly, it uncoupled the Franco-Spanish great power rivalry from the local German problems. Thirdly, it was underpinned by a system of mutual and external guarantees. France and Sweden guaranteed the peace settlement, and the contractants also guaranteed it. And all this, fourthly, achieved without exhaustion and without ceasefire. The war continued between France and Spain, even after this peace, but it was uncoupled from Germany. As Liana Fix said, the Körber-Stiftung and my Forum for Geopolitics in Cambridge has been exploring whether and how the lessons of peacemaking can be applied to the Middle East of today. We've had workshops in Cambridge, in Berlin, and Amman, and we have had participants from Europe and across the Middle East. And the results of our work you can read in this very interesting report, Reinventing Westphalia. I'd like to propose that we treat these lessons not as a formal framework that we have to follow slavishly, but simply as a series of inspirations. And it's based on those inspirations that I'm going to ask our distinguished panel some questions. I'd like to begin with Dr. Özhan. And it's obvious that Turkey is a major regional power. My question to you would be, are guarantors for a peace settlement in the Middle East helpful? Is that concept a helpful idea? Would Turkey wish to play such a role? And what, in that case, would you like to see guaranteed?
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this panel in a very general title of foreign policy issues. Putting Middle East as a special session at this time is quite important. Yes, Turkish intervention and Turkish possible role of guarantor is quite important. Right now, Turkey militarily and politically very much involved, not only Middle East, but I should say Middle East crisis. But Turkey is not alone. Right now, we are having even broader and general crisis, which is unsettled World War I order, dissolved by Arab uprisings and Arab Spring, and still we are suffering from that disorder currently. And the global atmosphere, regional atmosphere is not either helping. Right now we are having a deeply global political depression, and under that, the first victim is the geopolitics. So there is not a single actor who is offering a visionary geopolitical roadmap, which is going to end up, we may like it or not, a kind of order or at least a new status quo. This is not apparent in a foreseeable future, and instead of this geopolitical visionary approach, we are having just tactical moves, even not strategical, and entire Middle East right now turned into like a financial tool. Everybody is hedging towards everybody, not only towards actors, but also towards issues. Even in financial world, I mean, you do not hedge this much, because everybody knows what happens when you have such a chaotic risk aversion policy. So right now, the crisis is getting bigger and bigger. The Turkish role is quite different from what was the visionary approach 5 years ago and now. 5 years ago, there was more collaboration in the Middle East. 5 years ago, we were having at least a kind of possible, even at the minimum level, order in the future of the Middle East, but right now it is more chaotic. Unfortunately, the West also played a very important role right after or during the coup happening in Egypt. Unfortunately, Obama just changed the US policy, literally. He didn't keep the promises he gave, I will say bluntly, in 2009 in the Cairo speech. And those demand for change in the Middle East, unfortunately, faced with a very heavy price. And right after coup, we had seen the chemical weapons used in Damascus, and Syrian regime and the actors of change all got their messages from that attitude. So if you want to change, the price was Syria. If that revolution hadn't been prevented in Syria, we could have been, or we were going to be in a very different Middle East and the Gulf. But right now, unfortunately, we are far away from there. And what was the Turkish vision 5 years ago is some kind of regional cooperation and partnership, at least in a minimum way, which could provide a certain security for all the actors. Unfortunately, where we are right now is all political fault lines are broken, and what we are dealing is just conjunctural, daily, tactical moves, which is following any actor. And mainly, the terrorism turned itself into a biggest issue because that terrorism is also a very good comfort zone. Instead of producing geopolitics and visionary approach, ISIS filled entire global agenda, not only Turkish and Middle Eastern agenda, literally the biggest coalition world ever seen in the modern times claimed that they are fighting against ISIS, and it took years because under that banner, everybody was hedging their positions towards in a very different variety of issues. Unfortunately, the result is not very positive. And out of that result, right now, both Turkey, Iran, and Russia and United States militarily had to involve in Syria. Iraq is in a big crisis. And all this telling me the following, and I'll finish. The title of panel was Historical Possible Lessons and the Future Peace. When I hear the word history and historical in the Middle East, it is quite a dangerous thing because it never finishes, I mean. I'm from a city called Malatya in Turkey, eastern Turkey. There is a big debate, I mean, when was the first civilization settled in our city, 8,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago? So if we jump into history, it's a huge, deep issue. But there are three important historical political minds in the Middle East. And it is true, by the way. They have state experience, they have a tradition, they have a deep historical background. Both Turkish, Arab, and Iranian historical political mind has a very deep historical story. But that does not necessarily mean it could produce experience, maturity, and wise decisions always. And there are three very young and energetic political ambitions in the Middle East. One of them is Kurdish one. They don't have any state experience and political mind. The other one is Palestinians and Jews. Yes, Jews has a long history. Palestinians are part of Arab political mind. But at the same time, they are in the trap of survival political mentality. So they are not able to produce wise approaches, decisions in this current crisis. So when I put these three different political minds and the approaches, what we are getting is currently the Middle East, the current Middle East. Who could help? Who could be a leverage? Maybe outsiders. Russians, they have a very interesting history with the Middle East. I don't want to get into it, it's a long title. West, the Americans, it is also a very problematic one. Europe, as today expressed very well, could be a very important actor, especially last 5 years. Unfortunately, those Arab uprisings and the other crises just coincided, maybe the biggest financial crisis, which turned into economic crisis in late 2008, and unfortunately Europe is dealing with their own problems. And we are living in the, what I call, age of exits after this Brexit thing, and it is not helping nobody. That thing, unfortunately, produced itself in our region too. And unless we come back to a geopolitics and sound policies and get rid of at least some of those tactical and conjunctural approaches, the future for the peace does not look very positive.
Thank you very much indeed. Rula Khalaf, one of the really central bits of the Westphalian settlement was the internal power sharing arrangement, which was then anchored in a broader context. You have immense experience in the region. What do you see as being the prospects for power sharing, both internally in the disputed areas and perhaps on a transnational basis?
I think you're right to draw these parallels, and I thought it was very well done in the report. And I think theoretically, you could say that power sharing can and should work in the Middle East, both on a micro level. Lebanon, for instance, is an example of power sharing which just about works. Iraq was an attempted power sharing arrangement. Syria, if it is to emerge as one unified state, will have to have power sharing. The problem, I think, today is that we are not at the end game yet in the region. And let me just cite 3 reasons for that. One is that I think the propensity, the willingness to actually confront and to fight is very much alive. We only need to look at the last couple of years and look at the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It has morphed into more and more conflagrations from Yemen to Syria, from Syria to Yemen, from Yemen potentially in the next few months, Lebanon as well. Every single country in this region now has some kind of political and security tension. So I think that particularly with the emergence of a new Saudi regime, the readiness for compromise at this stage is simply not there. The second reason, I think, is the idea of a guarantor. If you want a power sharing arrangement within states and also between the regional powers, because this is what you would need in the Middle East, you'd need the regional states to be guaranteeing power sharing arrangements in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and then you need international guarantors. So again, in theory, the US and Russia are the right international guarantors. Both of them have very important interests in the Middle East. I think with the current US administration, though, I can't see a likelihood for any role in power sharing. What I see instead is an attempt to feed these conflicts and to develop them further and to produce more and more explosions. And I think the third element that would be essential for any power sharing arrangement is legitimacy. In the Middle East today, there is a crisis of legitimacy absolutely everywhere. I can think of one legitimate government, and that is actually in North Africa, in Tunisia. we have to remember that we have various conflicts that feed onto each other in the Middle East. And the Arab Spring was an example of the root cause of a lot of the problems in the Middle East. We tend to today just believe that because the Arab Spring gave rise to chaos, to disorder, that it didn't mean much, or that we can forget those few years. But that was the crisis of legitimacy manifesting itself. And I think without some form of democratic system, it would be very difficult to have power sharing.
Thank you very much. So I think we've looked now at the broader context. I'd like to drill down a little bit for a moment into a specific problem. Volker, Perthes, I think there are a few people who know as much about the Syrian crisis as you do. I understand you've just been at the Geneva talks and you're going to return there, so thank you for being here. You come, as it were, from the diplomatic front line. My question to you would be, what do you see as being the central elements that would need to be settled to achieve a peace in Syria? And is that even possible without a broader Middle Eastern or regional context?
Well, if the Syrians would have to wait for peace, love, and joy in the Middle East until they can make their own peace, they would have to wait for a long time, I suppose. So therefore, even if you were correct analytically, I would deny it and say, no, we have to start in Syria. And we have to start by understanding what the nature of the conflict in Syria is and what it was when it started. So it started as a local conflict, which, I mean, to abstract a little bit, you could say was a conflict about inclusion and exclusion, who is part of the game, who is not. And then it became very, very quickly regionalized and internationalized or geopoliticized, or whatever you want to call it. So now we need an understanding, at least on two levels. The one is between Syrians. And here I think UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which sort of happens to be the Bible or the Quran of Staffan de Mistura and the people who work with him, has quite an intelligent term for it. They do not speak about a certain model of governance, but they say it needs to be inclusive and credible governance. And I would put the emphasis on inclusive, which is probably a softer expression for power sharing. I would agree with Rola that power sharing would ideally be the recipe for many Middle Eastern societies. But then we have to admit that not the 7,000 years of history, but the last 55 years of history in a country like Syria, or also in Iraq, are half a century of not having even the slightest idea of concept of power sharing. Power sharing was against the ideology of the ruling forces, particularly in the countries ruled by the Ba'ath Party. So there is no socialization, not on the side of the opposition and not on the side of the government, with anybody, with anything like power sharing. It is you're in or out, you're dead or alive. You win and you're alive, you lose and you're dead. So to forge a consensus about some form of inclusivity is, I think, the main challenge. And then, of course, you need the regional and international level. You need an understanding. I actually like when you said what are the elements of inspiration we could get from Westphalia. You mentioned the decoupling. We need at least an understanding from the regional international powers that do have influence in Syria to support such an inclusive solution in the country, and decoupling, not play their own geopolitical games in Syria in the future. Because as long as regional or international powers are there, and they may call themselves guarantors, and they use the concept of guarantor just to get legitimacy for staying there for the long term, they will keep Syria in the geopolitical conflicts of the region, and that means that it will not come to peace internally. Let me just, because you started, Brendan, by saying sort of one of the things you think about when you start comparing Westphalia, or the 30 Years' War rather, and the wars and conflicts in the Middle East, is religious and ethnic conflicts. I think we have to make clear, again, going back to the origins of the conflict in Syria, that is and has never been a religious war. It hasn't even been a war about exclusive identities. I would claim, and we have a couple of Syrians in the room here who could probably contradict me or not, I would claim that sectarian and ethnic identities in Syria have been shaped much more by 7 years of war than these identities having been responsible for triggering the war. And I think that is something we have to make clear to ourselves when we speak even about Libya, even about Yemen, that war may shape identities much more than identities shaping the war or triggering the war.
Thank you. So, Volker, one of the things you said I thought was interesting but also contentious was that, you know, one shouldn't wait in Syria for a broader Middle Eastern peace because you might be waiting for a long time. Simultaneously, though, there are many pressures bearing in, as we've been hearing, on Syria from outside. So I'd like to just explore for a minute with the two other members of the panel whether they think that these conflicts, and it's not just Syria, we're talking about potentially Israel, Palestine, and other issues, whether they can be treated in a piecemeal fashion. Is any one of those conflicts the central conflict, where we would say, if we solve that, that's the open sesame, that's the key that will unlock everything else? And does it make sense to see these all in connection and as something that can only be solved in one great solution, or should we go at them piecemeal? So I wonder, Taha, Özhan, if I might begin with you. How useful is it to see things in isolation, or do we need to do it all as part of one package, do you think?
I mean, I don't see any, in a foreseeable future, any one package solution. It is directly linked to the crisis which I depicted, a geopolitical crisis or political depression we're getting through. I don't see any Westphalian style packages are, by the way, not offered by nobody. And main actors are not in that form either. Both United States, Russia, and regional powers, none of them are offering one package and one shop, one-stop shop, and you'll solve at least more than 50% of the problems. And it is already being dealt with the very specific issues, not only specific issues, very particular regions in regions. So the issue is getting more complicated, while the techniques used are getting unsophisticated. So we are right now more ethnic and sectarian based. Most of the tactics are based on that. And in mid-term and long-term, I don't see any offer is coming, not one package, at least in a visionary level. For example, the Iraq. Everybody, I believe, accepts at some level there's a huge Sunni resentment is getting accumulated, and it is on making. And we know from the story in the past what happens when that happened, in Iraq at least, and how it infected and had a spillover effect. But if you come up with any kind of geopolitical visionary, one package, as your term, approach to do that, you don't have any partner to collaborate and deal with that issue. And it is on the table, but on the field, it is terrorism, migration issue, and spillover effect. My last thing should be the following. We should be understanding in this current state, there is no isolated issues, crisis, problems. If there is a crisis start, It's just the first stop where it started. If you deal with it, you may manage it. If you do not, there is definitely a spillover effect, first in that region, then elsewhere in the world, in the forms of terrorism, migration, other issues, but we should be understanding there is no isolated crisis anymore.
Well, Khalaf, how do you see it? I mean, as Taha says, there is no such solution on offer, but do you think these crises can be solved without one, in the sense, or do you think it's not so much a puzzle where we have to get all the pieces in place, but rather, to mix my metaphors a bit, a sort of patchwork mosaic where we have to do lots of rather small, detailed work? What's your view?
I think it's both a puzzle and a patchwork mosaic, in order to confuse your metaphors even more. But you have to manage the individual crises, but you do need an overarching understanding as well. You have two different, very different, and completely separate conflicts in the region. You have the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is unrelated to a lot of the other problems. And then you have a broader regional rivalry that is playing out in various countries, but it is playing out because these countries have weaknesses of their own, because there are fractures in these communities. So I think you have to work on both levels. You have to deal with the individual issues in various countries, where sometimes I think they could be socioeconomic rather than political. And at the same time, if you had, I mean, this is all very theoretical because it's not about to happen, but if you had a regional security arrangement, let's call it, between Iran and the Gulf, then I think you could address and you could help resolve a lot of the other conflicts.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to some questions in a minute, but I'd like to ask the last question of Volker Perthes, which is to do with the often expressed hope that Europe should become more involved in the region. And it's a double question, really, and it may be the same question, which is, do you see a guarantor role for Europe here? And could you see a sort of soft power role for Germany specifically, as bringing the lesson of its own experience to the region?
I will answer your question, but I would like to have a 20-second comment on Rola, because I think she is right, but please notice that she spoke in the conditional voice to say if there was a regional security arrangement, it would be good. Yes, I'm not seeing it. I would wish it would be there, and because I'm not seeing that, I think we have to concentrate on the conflicts in the individual parts and parcels of the Middle East. And I guess, Brendan, since I'm not totally free to speak here also representing the special envoy, I would also answer you in the conditional voice and said, yes, I would wish for Europe to have a strategy, or have had a strategy for the last 7 years on Syria, and come in more constructively in then being an active player and being able to be a guarantor. But, well, I probably leave it with that. I wish it to happen, but it would need more to happen in Brussels and between Berlin and Paris and Rome and some other capitals in Europe to make such a strategy develop than only seeing the grievances in Syria and the war in Syria and complaining that the Russians and the Iranians and the Turks are doing things which we probably don't particularly like.
Thank you. So I'm now going to turn it over to questions. If we've got time at the end, the panel can have a 1-minute summing up. If you could give your name, please, your affiliation, and also be as brief as possible. Thank you. Sir.
Okay. My name is Zahrani from Iran. I think we have to have a theoretical debate between cause of the war and how we end the war. Is there any relation between the beginning of the war and causes of the beginning of the war and the mechanism of ending the war. That, I think, is not being talked about when it comes to Syrian conflict. The second issue, I very much agree with Professor Perthes. This war is not ethnic conflict. So this Westphalian model of conflict resolution, I don't think would be a possible, solution for this war. A war with all these different actors and for a long time is very, very wishful thinking if we think that we can have a large picture and geopolitical solution for that. Two things are going on now. One is Astana process. That has been at least effective to minimize bloodshed, and that is a beginning for larger process and larger solution. The other is Geneva Conference. I think these two has to go together. In my thinking, if Astana process has been able enough to diminish bloodshed, let's support that one along with what is going on in Geneva. Hopefully, in midterm, we will have a long-term solution for Syria.
Thank you. We'll take one more question here in the front, and then I'll get the panel to answer these two. Yes, sir? Well, all right.
Well, thank you very much, Galip Talay Al-Shak from Istanbul. I think one of the trouble that we are facing, there perhaps analogy with Westphalia is also valid. Here we are talking about, the legitimacy crisis is very much tied with the personality, not only the system. We're not talking about if we establish some kind of balance of power between different components, then we'll be able to solve the crisis. I think as if it would have been impossible for Gaddafi to preside over transition in Libya, I think as it would have been impossible for Saddam to preside over some kind of transition in Iraq, I think it's also impossible for Assad to preside over any transition in Syria, and then we expecting some form of stability. Because in this regard, I resemble it to more to the fascism in the 1930s in Europe, where you could not have transition under Mussolini. So particularly in Syria, how much hopeful one can be, given the fact right now we're forcing, a transition under the leadership of a person who was, primarily the root cause of the crisis in the first place.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the panel to answer those questions. Don't feel that you have to answer each one, as it were, but just respond to whatever you feel able to. Who would like to begin?
I'm happy.
Ulla, please.
I want to pick up on the last point. I think the dilemma that we face in Syria, and I think one has to say it very clearly, Assad, thanks to Iran and Russia, won this war. This is the reality. We may not like it, but it is the reality. And the dilemma is, how do you then make, the leader who won the war, how do you remove him? Because what is also true, and I think we have to be clear about that too, is that there is no peaceful future for Syria if Assad remains in power. And I think that is the dilemma that Staffan de Mistura has to grapple with. I don't happen to see in any kind of inclusive process that's going to overcome this. That's why, in many ways, I agree with you that Astana and de-escalation is probably the best that one can hope for at this stage.
Thank you.
I don't have much to add, but just to follow up what you have just said. At this moment, we could talk about what we had been through last 5 years in Syria. And everybody know quite clear how we arrived this stage. And main issue from the beginning was what kind of transition in Syria is going to be, what kind of government is going to be emerged. These were not the issues. The main issue from the beginning was the human tragedy, because it escalated in a immense level with regime killings and its supporters, what they did to Syria. And the terrorism, as expected, popped up, and it was a very useful tool. All helped to get a bigger and bigger human tragedy. Those de-escalation policies, small parcels where we are trying to have no-fire zones, no-fly zones, all of them are actually trying to reach, to stop at least human tragedy. Very little success on that level. Still, the massacres are taking place, but at least in some region, people can have some refuge. But there is no guarantee, even at this moment. Both Astana process, Turkish, Iranian, Russian trilateral approach would guarantee this human tragedy will end near soon. It could anytime re-escalate.
Volker, did you want to add anything to
Well,
that?
three short points, perhaps. The first to Dr. Zahrani, the causes of the war and the recipes for ending it. I think analytically, and also for the good ideas of diplomats, it's also useful to remind oneself what were the causes of the war. But at some point, especially if you don't get an international agreement on that international question, you simply have to get the process going, even if you disagree about the causes. Now, I would say that a couple of the regional players who have made life difficult for those who want to make peace in Syria weren't the cause of the war. I mean, neither Saudi Arabia, nor Qatar, nor Iran, nor Turkey started the war. But they all have had a hand in the war during the last 7 years. So you have to work with them, and you have to make them part of the solution. Astana and Geneva, yes, they do complement one another. We are actually at the United Nations, even though that Astana is not a UN-led process, but basically a Russian initiative. We are supporting it with expertise. We appreciate that it has led to a de-escalation in some areas, but mind you, the war is not over in Syria. It is difficult to do the head count and to give averages, but I would say over the last couple of months, we have like 30 to 50 to 60 people killed every day. And that doesn't mean that the war is over. And we have had higher numbers in the last couple of weeks, including at least 2 of the 4 so-called de-escalation zones where a lot of killing took place. As to whom you can negotiate with, Ghalib, and who you can bring into the peace process, we do have a constellation in Geneva where one party says, we cannot negotiate with the others because they include terrorists. And the others say, we can negotiate, but we cannot accept the future presence of a regime that is using repression and that is under the leadership of the person who is in charge. Our approach is to say, if you want to make peace, you have to do it with those who wield the means of force, with those who command the military, because if you just get the nice people of Syria together, you will get a consensus, but not a peace in the country.
Thank you. So yeah, I've seen 3 hands up. There was the gentleman here, and there are 2 people there, and then we'll have the response. Please.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Abdelati. I'm the ambassador of Egypt here in Berlin. I have just a short comment since we are talking about historical lessons to be drawn out of Westphalia model for the future peace in the Middle East. I believe that the point of departure here is to respect the sovereignty and the nation state. the birth of the nation state and sovereignty was at the end of Westphalia in 1648. So this is something extremely important. Of course, inclusiveness, power sharing as, of course, preconditions for having peace. But on the other hand, without respecting the sovereignty and keeping and maintaining the nation state, nothing is going to be achieved in the future. Look to what happened in Iraq or in Libya. We destroyed everything there without caring about the day after. And as Minister Gabriel mentioned in the opening session today, that whenever you have a vacuum, then you have others who are going to fill the vacuum. So, and this is quite obvious in our region. Whenever you have a vacuum, you have militia, you have terrorist organizations are filling the vacuum, and we are, as the countries in the region, who are paying the price for that. At the end of the story, the French, the Brits left Libya, but we are there, we stuck there. We have 1,200 kilometers border with Libya, and you don't have a partner on the other side of the border. So again, let us be practical, and it's very important to respect the sovereignties of the countries and the nation state. Of course, that should be complemented with more democratic nature of those regimes, more inclusiveness, more power sharing. Thank you.
So there are two questions here, then Mr. Sajapur, and then we'll have to stop, I'm afraid.
Can I? Oh, no, it's okay. Dr. Semeni from Kyiv. Just taking all the complexity of the war in Syria and the crisis all in around, I have the feeling, and probably the question to all of the three panelists, that this war, and to some extent it internal war and proxy war by many actors from outside and even bordering on this country, will be in place for so much years until these all actors have some kind of resources to have this war. Because if you take seriously, and even officially declared, some states are in very contradiction. And the question is actually, either the war will go on until all of these actors will have enough resources, or it will go until some kind of package or some settlement, which will be some minimum agreed among all, will take place, or the most negative scenario, when it will be just zero-sum game, when somebody or some coalition against another coalition will be totally defeated, and then it was peaceful settlement. So three options, what do you think will happen, actually?
Thank you. Was there a questioner from Syria here? Just, I think, yeah, one from Syria.
I'm Samir Al-Taki from Syria. Actually, I'm very much afraid of a certain moment like Mr. Bush when he said mission accomplished. No, there had been no real study about why ISIS returned to Mosul, where you can wrap up such a crisis and leave lots of grievances, and then suddenly you see the crisis exploding. So my point here is that without the intruders, there is no war now in Syria. And without the Syrians, there is no peace. And acknowledging this, how can we work on this exactly? We have a main factor here that I don't expect in the region a Yalta agreement, a peace and security agreement, maybe in 15 years. So how can we disengage this situation? And here we need to understand something new now. There is an erosion in the war. The life cycle of the Syrian war is coming into a level where all partners, all participants had eroded the possibility to get a complete victory through non-state players. The next step will be through armies, through direct involvement. The Russian began, it won't be the last one. So my point from one side is at the level of the international regional, there is this risk. The other side, at the Syrian level, there had been a complete erosion of the war itself. We have some symbols like Bashar al-Assad, like other that should be punished, but we have the the other side of it, that the Syrians are ready, and nobody is initiating a real dialogue between Syrians at the level of the grassroots of people inside Syria to initiate this process. Sorry for the long question.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've actually run out of time. So all I can propose is that we have a 10-second final word from each of the panelists. Going in reverse order now. Volker, would you like to?
I just take Samir Taki's last point. I don't think that it is possible, as long as the war goes on, to organize a dialogue between the Syrians inside Syria. And once the war is settled and we don't have any more shooting and bombing, probably you don't need anybody from outside to organize this dialogue inside Syria.
Ulla.
Well, I would just suggest that not only do current crises have to be managed and managed very delicately, but there has to also be diplomatic work in order to prevent the next crisis, because if we're sitting here next year, we'll have yet another country to be talking about.
Taha, you have
I'm done.
You're done. Well, thank you very much. My apologies to everybody who wasn't able to ask a question. I think it's been an incredible panel. The next one, equally on the Middle East, is almost upon us. It remains only for me to thank, first of all, Körber for the collaboration with the Forum on Geopolitics in Cambridge, and to thank in particular our three distinguished panelists for giving us such an interesting insight. Thank you.